They said the Warrington farmhouse looked different on the night the girl began to melt, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. In 1849, Alabama was no stranger to sickness, but nothing the town had ever seen prepared them for the sound that tore from young Elise Warrington's throat. A sound so raw and desperate that neighbors later swore it didn't come from a child at all. When they found her in the yard, her skin was cool, her heartbeat steady. Yet she couldn't stand because she said her legs felt liquid. By dawn, 3 different doctors had entered her bedroom. All 3 walked out trembling, refusing to touch her, refusing to speak of what they saw. And by the time the sun rose fully, the Warringtons were barricading the windows, because Elise had started whispering names no living soul had uttered in decades, names of girls who had vanished long before she was born, each one delivered in a voice that didn't belong to her. The night of the first scream would be remembered in Warrington Hollow, long after the house itself rotted into the earth, because it didn't sound like terror or pain. It sounded like something being pulled apart from the inside. Elise Warrington had been playing outside earlier that evening, chasing fireflies the way she always did at the start of spring, her laughter drifting across the dry Alabama fields like a tiny spark of life in a place where the soil had long forgotten gentleness. Her mother remembered watching her, brushing dirt off her apron, thinking how delicate Elise looked in that fading orange light, as if she were made of something that sunlight could dissolve. No one in town had ever feared for Elise. The Warringtons were quiet people, humble, hard-working, the type who kept to themselves but never let pride harden their hearts. So when the scream tore through the night, a sound jagged enough to rattle window panes, the neighbors froze, not because they expected tragedy, but because the sound seemed too violent, too primal, too unnatural to have come from that small, soft-voiced girl. Mrs. Warrington dropped her lantern when she heard it. It hit the plank floor and rolled, spraying an arc of trembling light across the walls as she sprinted outside. The yard was still, windless, the kind of humid darkness where every sound felt thick. But Elise was moving, crawling, dragging herself across the dirt like her bones had turned to ash. Her palms smeared the ground beneath her, her breath breaking in short, panicked bursts as though something inside her chest was collapsing. She was only 10 years old, but in that moment she looked impossibly fragile. When her mother knelt beside her, hands trembling as she tried to lift her, Elise shook her head violently, choking out the words that would haunt her family for years. "Mama! I can't stand my legs. They're melting." Her mother didn't understand at first. She thought Elise meant they were numb or hurt, or perhaps she'd been bitten by something in the grass. But when she touched her daughter's calves, she felt no tension, no resistance. Nothing resembling muscle or bone beneath the skin. It was like pressing into a bag of warm water. Elise whimpered and clutched at the dirt, curling into herself as if trying to keep whatever was happening from spreading upward. Mrs. Warrington screamed for help, then, her voice breaking the quiet night just as her daughter's had done. Lanterns flickered to life in the neighboring houses. Doors creaked open. People rushed toward the sound because in small towns, instinct still wins over fear until fear becomes undeniable. The first neighbor to reach them froze in place when he saw Elise on the ground. She wasn't bleeding. She wasn't bruised. There were no signs of injury anywhere on her body. And yet she couldn't straighten her legs, couldn't lift her hips, couldn't even push herself upright. Her skin looked normal, but something beneath it was terribly wrong. She kept whispering that she felt herself going down, as if sinking inside her own body. Her mother tried to hold her, to comfort her, but Elise cried out that it hurt, that everything inside her felt hot and soft, that her knees were slipping away like wax left too close to a flame. More neighbors arrived, whispering, crossing themselves, insisting someone bring the doctor. But even as people rushed to help, an eerie stillness clung to the yard. The air felt heavier. The insects had gone silent. And beneath the rising panic, a quiet dread settled over those gathered, because no one, not a single person, could explain how a child could scream that her bones were melting when her skin showed no mark at all. When the first doctor arrived at the Warrington farmhouse, the lantern light trembling in his hand said more than his words ever could. Dr. Harlan was a seasoned man, one who had delivered babies in thunderstorms and stitched up farmers mauled by their own equipment, but nothing in his long years of practice prepared him for the small, shaking figure lying on the Warringtons' parlor floor. Elise had been moved inside, but she wouldn't stop saying she felt herself slipping as if gravity were pulling her inward. Her clothing clung strangely to her body, as though there was less structure beneath it than there should be. When Dr. Harlan knelt beside her, he tried to speak softly to ask her where it hurt, but his voice faltered when he placed his hands on her shins and pressed with the gentle firmness of someone who had examined hundreds of legs before. His fingers sank too far, as if through softened clay. He pulled back instantly, almost recoiling, his face draining of color as he stared at the girl who should have cried out in pain but instead whimpered because she could feel her bones moving like soup. He didn't say a word to the family. He didn't ask for water or cloth or instruments. He simply stood, quietly gathered his things, and stepped away from Elise as though proximity alone threatened him. When Mr. Warrington demanded an explanation, Dr. Harlan only shook his head, muttering something about no moment and not natural. Then he hurried out, bumping the doorframe on his way as if he couldn't get out fast enough. The family watched him disappear into the darkness, stunned and terrified, but with no choice except to send for another doctor. Perhaps Harlan was tired. Perhaps he had lost his nerve. That was what they told themselves, even though deep down they knew they had seen real fear in a man not easily shaken. The second doctor, Dr. Prentice, arrived an hour later, breathless and half awake, clutching his medical bag like it was a shield. He approached Elise more cautiously, circling her, taking in the odd stillness of her skin, the glossy sheen of sweat on her forehead, the way she held her arms stiffly as though afraid they too might begin to give way. He asked her to move her legs, and when she tried, only a faint ripple groaned beneath the fabric of her nightgown. Nothing that resembled a limb responding to command. Dr. Prentice reached out to examine her thigh, but the moment his fingers made contact, he went rigid. He didn't press any further. He didn't even bend down to look closely. Instead, he straightened slowly, his face a mask of dread, and whispered something to Mr. Warrington that made the man's knees buckle. "You should pray. This isn't sickness. Something is wrong in a way I cannot touch." And like the first doctor, he backed away, collected his things, and left the house without looking back. By then, Elise had begun to cry again, her voice hoarse from the effort, every breath trembling with the sensation that her insides were sliding downward. Her mother clung to her hand, whispering reassurances she didn't believe, her eyes flicking constantly toward the doorway in desperate hope that anyone would help. Instead, when the third doctor arrived shortly before dawn, the air in the room had grown so heavy with dread that he hesitated before even crossing the threshold. This doctor, a younger man named Thackeray, tried to reassure the family with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He approached Elise slowly, carefully, as though she were a fragile piece of glass balanced on the edge of a shelf. He asked her where the pain was worst, and she whispered that it wasn't pain exactly, it felt more like everything inside sinking, 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 when he finally touched her. Even through a blanket they had draped over her legs, his entire body jolted like he had been shocked. He staggered backward, knocking over a chair, and stared at her with a horror so naked it made Mrs. Warrington's breath catch. Dr. Thackeray wiped his hands on his coat as if trying to rid himself of something clinging to them, then shook his head violently. He refused to examine her further, refused to stay even another minute. He grabbed his bag, muttering fragmented phrases, "Not a medical case. Shouldn't be alive. Something beneath the skin," before bolting through the front door and disappearing into the paling night, leaving the Warrington family alone with the terrible knowledge that whatever was happening to Elise was so unnatural that 3 trained physicians would rather flee than try to save her. It was near noon when Mr. Warrington, desperate and hollow-eyed from a night without answers, decided he needed to dig into the past that his family had always tiptoed around. The doctor's terror, the way each man had recoiled as if Elise carried something unholy beneath her skin, had broken whatever quiet resignation he once carried about old family rumors. There had always been whispers, murmurs at church gatherings, sideways glances from elders who seemed to know something they never said aloud. So he left the trembling house, left Elise drifting in and out of shallow breaths, and walked toward the town hall archives, a leaning brick building that baked under the Alabama sun like a kill for secrets. Inside, dust hung thick as fog, and the clerk on duty looked at him with wary recognition, as if sensing why he'd come before he even spoke. When he asked for the Warrington family records, she hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the shelves where the oldest documents rested. With a slow nod, she led him to a wooden cabinet swollen with humidity and age, its drawers heavy with parchment that seemed to hum with the weight of buried stories. He sifted through birth records first, then death logs, then the brittle, yellowed notes kept by doctors long past. It didn't take long before he noticed a pattern too neat, too sharp, too exact to be coincidence. Every Warrington daughter born between the months of March and May had died before her 14th birthday. 5 girls over the span of nearly 80 years, each one taken by what the doctors of earlier generations had described in vague, trembling language: dissolution of the inner structure, unexplained collapse of form, body losing integrity, unknown wasting, origin unnatural. Each description felt like a cold hand closing around his throat. These weren't illnesses. These were horrors the town had chosen to bury under layers of silence. With each record he read, familiarity twisted his gut, the way neighbors had always watched his wife during her pregnancy. The soft warnings disguised as neighborly concern, the way his own mother had urged him to move north after Elise was born. He chalked it all up to old superstition, but now, with Elise melting away in the parlor, he felt the truth sharpen like glass. The clerk hovered near him, shifting nervously. When he asked if she knew anything, she went pale, her voice barely above a whisper, as she admitted that her grandmother used to warn young women never to marry into the Warrington line if they wanted daughters who lived. She said it so casually, like repeating an old folk tale, but the tremble in her voice revealed something deeper, fear that had been handed down through generations like a family heirloom. He asked her whether there had ever been an explanation, a cure, a way to stop it, but she shook her head quickly, insisting there was no cure because the old folks never believed it was an illness. They believed it was a debt, something owed from long ago, something tied to the land or the blood or the sins of an ancestor no one dared to name. Mr. Warrington refused to accept it. He insisted on pulling more documents, searching for any mention of rituals, accusations, old feuds, anything that might explain why only the girls were taken and why springtime marked the beginning of their undoing. In the back of one drawer, he found a folded paper, brittle and stained, written in a spidery script from 1798. It described the death of a Warrington girl named Anna, who'd been found soft to the touch, though her skin remained whole, and whose mother had claimed that, in her final hours, Anna had whispered that she heard voices calling her from beneath the floorboards. Another note, dated 1816, described a girl who told her pastor that she dreamed of sinking into the earth, of something ancient beneath the soil, pressing upward toward her. Each account mirrored Elise's words too closely to dismiss. The realization crashed over him with suffocating clarity. This wasn't new. This was the continuation of something that had been festering in their bloodline for generations, something no one had dared confront. And he understood, with a quiet terror that almost buckled his knees, that Elise had never stood a chance against a fate written long before she was born. Elise had hardly slept since the night her body first began to betray her, drifting instead between bouts of feverish clarity and long stretches, where she stared blankly at the ceiling as though listening to something no one else could hear. Her mother sat beside her constantly, stroking her hair. Pretending she didn't, he noticed the way Elise's body seemed to be slowly sinking into itself. By the 4th day, her arms had grown thin and oddly pliant, her movements sluggish, her grip too soft, like the strength inside her hands was dissolving. But it wasn't the physical unraveling that terrified her parents the most. It was the voice she used when she finally began to speak again. It started as a faint whisper late in the night, a sound so small that Mrs. Warrington thought at first that Elise was sleep-talking. But then Elise whispered a name. Anna, a name her mother had never taught her, a name belonging to a girl dead for over 30 years. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. When she asked Elise who Anna was, the child blinked slowly, confusion clouding her eyes as if she herself didn't understand what she was hearing. Then she whispered another name, and another. Names that only existed in the brittle pages of the records her father had found earlier that day. Names of Warrington girls who had melted away long before Elise was born. Mrs. Warrington froze, unable to breathe, staring at her daughter as though the child's voice had turned into a stranger's. Elise's tone shifted each time she spoke, sometimes trembling and high like a frightened 12-year-old, sometimes lower and rougher, like a girl on the edge of death. At first the changes were brief, flickers like the cracking of a candle's flame. But then Elise began speaking in sentences, whispering things no living child should know: how one girl had died in her mother's lap, how another felt her spine drip like warm tallow, how another had heard scraping beneath her bed every night before the melting began. The room grew colder as she spoke, as though the walls themselves were drawing inward too. Listen. Mr. Warrington returned home to the sound of these shifting voices coming through the door, his heart pounding so hard he nearly dropped the stack of old documents in his hands. He stood in the doorway, watching his daughter's lips move in a voice that did not belong to her, one he'd only ever imagined when reading dead girls' descriptions scrawled in shaking handwriting. Elise's eyes were glassy, unfocused, yet she responded when her mother touched her, snapping briefly back into herself before slipping away again. When she spoke in her own voice, she asked why the room felt crowded, asked why she heard crying in the corners, asked her parents why the girls in the walls were calling her by name. Neither parent could answer. They could barely stay upright. The doctor reports had been horrifying enough, the family records worse, but this was a new terror entirely. This was Elise acting as a vessel for voices silenced decades before. Voices that had been swallowed by a curse or a debt or something nameless that had seeped into their bloodline. She told them the girls were angry, that they wanted to be seen, that they were reaching upward because no one had ever freed them. Sometimes she whimpered mid-sentence, clamping her hands over her ears as if trying to block out the sound of someone whispering directly into her skull. One moment she would speak as herself, terrified and desperate, and the next she would slip into a tone steeped in sorrow not her own, describing the sensation of dissolving organs, collapsing ribs, the feeling of sinking into a darkness that had no floor. By the fifth night, Elise no longer seemed to sleep at all. Her eyes remained half open, her breathing shallow, and her voice, her many voices wove together through the dark, creating a tapestry of grief and warning that no one in her family could shut out. And each time a new voice emerged from her trembling mouth, each time a whispered name floated through the dim glow of the lantern, the same message surfaced again and again, delivered in tones so hollow they seemed to echo from somewhere beneath the earth. She's next. The final night arrived with a heaviness that felt deliberate, as though the darkness had chosen that moment to settle over the Warrington house with full awareness of what was about to unfold. The air inside had grown stale, thick enough that every breath from Elise rattled like it had to fight its way out. Her body had sunk deeper into the mattress, her limbs soft and unresponsive beneath the thin blanket, her skin pale except for the faint bluish shadows that collected where bones should have been. Her parents hovered helplessly nearby, exhausted yet unable to look away, afraid that if they blinked too long, she might vanish into the bed entirely. Elise kept staring toward the far corner of the room, her eyes tracking something that neither of them could see, something she claimed had been watching her since sunset. Each time she tried to describe it, her voice trembled, and she would whisper that it wasn't a person and it wasn't a shadow, but something in between. Something waiting for her the way a collector waits for a debt long overdue. As the hours dragged on, she started sinking faster, her small frame sliding inward like gravity was pulling from beneath rather than above. She whimpered that she could feel her ribs softening, her spine uncoiling, her insides slipping downward as though her body had become nothing more than warm wax clinging to the shape of a child. Her mother tried to hold her, but Elise flinched, begging not to be touched because every place a hand rested left an indentation that took too long to lift back up, and each indentation made her more afraid. It wasn't just pain now. It was surrender. A terrifying sense that whatever was taking her wasn't merely destroying her body, but claiming her piece by piece. The voices grew louder too, slipping through her lips and hushed, overlapping murmurs, girls who had melted decades before, whispering warnings, telling her not to follow, but also telling her she had no choice. The room grew colder with each passing minute, so cold that condensation began forming on the window despite the humid Alabama air outside. Then Elise's frantic whispers stopped all at once. Her gaze shifted sharply to the dark corner across from her bed, her pupils widening until nearly swallowing the color of her eyes. Her breath came in shallow, fearful gasps, and she whispered that it was here. Her parents turned toward the corner, seeing nothing but a patch of shadow slightly darker than the rest, but Elise insisted it was moving, that it had arms too long to be human, that it had been waiting beneath the house for her bones to finally loosen completely. The lantern flickered violently, dimming as if something sucked the warmth right out of its flame, and for a single moment the shadow in the corner seemed to swell, stretching upward with a slow fluidity that made her father stagger back, his heart pounding so hard he felt it thud against his ribs. Elise cried that it wanted what was left of her, that it was calling the same way it had called the girls before her, that it had been patient, always patient, waiting for each Warrington daughter to reach the moment when her body broke enough for it to claim the remnants. Her mother tried to lift her from the bed in a desperate attempt to run, but Elise screamed, not from fear, but from the tearing sensation inside her as her body gave way further, collapsing inward like wet clay. The shadow stretched farther across the floor as though reaching for her, and her final words, spoken in a wavering mix of her own voice and the voices of all the girls before her, echoed through the suffocating air. "It's here. It's beneath me. It's pulling." And as the last bit of lantern light wavered, as the room darkened to a suffocating black, the Warringtons finally understood that this thing had never been after their land or their lives, but after their daughters, and that Elise, sinking into her own dissolving form, had been claimed by something older than their bloodline, something buried so deep in their history that it could only be described in whispers passed from dead girl to dead girl. And now she was becoming the next whisper, the next warning, the next voice calling out from the darkness for like, comment, and subscribe.